There is a strange reason Barbie the Diamond Castle still feels different from the dozens of animated movies that surrounded it in the late 2000s. On paper, it should have been disposable. It was a direct-to-DVD Barbie movie, built around dolls, songs, fantasy dresses, magical creatures, and a glittering castle. It never needed a theatrical release to become culturally important. And yet, underneath all that pink and purple packaging is something unexpectedly radical. A story in which the most important relationship is not a romance, not a royal marriage, and not a princess waiting to be rescued. It is a friendship between two young women who repeatedly choose each other, when the world gives them every reason to choose themselves. That distinction matters. Traditional fairy tales often build their emotional architecture around rescue. A princess is trapped, a prince arrives, the kingdom is restored, and romance becomes the reward. Diamond Castle quietly rearranges that formula. Liana and Alexa do not need princes to complete their story. They need courage, trust, forgiveness, and above all, each other. Their greatest victories happen when they stop trying to survive separately and remember that their strength comes from harmony. And the movie makes that idea literal through music. Two voices, one song is not simply a catchy number designed to sell a soundtrack. It establishes the central metaphor of the entire film. Two different voices can remain different while becoming stronger together. That concept eventually becomes the weapon that defeats Lydia, the philosophy that restores the muses, and the emotional truth behind the entire adventure. This is why calling Diamond Castle a shallow cash grab misses what makes it fascinating. Yes, the movie was connected to a toy empire. Yes, the costumes, instruments, pets, and fantasy accessories were commercially useful. But commercial intent does not automatically erase artistic intent. Sometimes the strangest cultural artifacts survive precisely because they contain something their creators understood better than their critics expected. Barbie the Diamond Castle is one of those artifacts. It is a female-led buddy adventure disguised as a fairy tale, a musical disguised as children's entertainment, and a story about resisting isolation disguised as a glittering fantasy quest. The question is not simply why children loved it. The more interesting question is why so many of them grew up, returned years later, and realized the movie had been telling them something surprisingly sophisticated all along. Section 1.2, Video Roadmap. To understand why this little direct-to-video fantasy has endured, we have to look far beyond the plot. We are going to pull apart Diamond Castle from almost every angle, beginning with the world that produced it and ending with the reason it still occupies such a strangely powerful place in the memories of an entire generation. First, we will travel back to the late 2000s Barbie era and examine the relationship between Mattel Entertainment and Mainframe Entertainment, the animation studio responsible for bringing this increasingly ambitious CGI universe to life. We will look at the business model behind direct-to-video animation, the expectations surrounding Barbie movies, and the creative limitations that existed alongside those commercial ambitions. Then we will enter the story itself. We will follow Liana and Alexa from their humble cottage through the destruction of their home, the discovery of Melody, the mystery of the Diamond Castle, the encounter with Lydia, and the devastating moment when friendship itself becomes the battlefield. But this will not simply be a recap. Every major story beat gives us another clue about what the movie believes friendship actually means. From there, we will examine the characters psychologically. Liana's resilience can look almost perfect until we notice how easily loyalty becomes pressure. Alexa's insecurity initially appears like weakness, until the film reveals how universal her desire for comfort really is. And Lydia becomes even more interesting when we stop viewing her as merely an evil sorceress and start seeing her as the distorted opposite of the two protagonists. We will also investigate the music. The orchestration, vocal harmonies, recurring motifs, and placement of songs all contribute to a structure that is far more deliberate than its reputation suggests. The film repeatedly uses music not as decoration, but as communication. When the characters are emotionally connected, their voices align. When that connection breaks, harmony becomes impossible. Then come the visual and mythological layers. The transformation of the muses, the contrast between natural flowers and artificial diamonds, the meaning of the heart-shaped stones, the architecture of the castle, and the echoes of classical mythology surrounding the muses themselves. Finally, we will step outside the movie and ask what happened after 2008. Why did audiences remember it when many bigger animated releases faded? Why did nostalgia culture rediscover it? And what does its survival tell us about the difference between critical prestige and emotional longevity? By the end, Diamond Castle will hopefully look less like a forgotten Barbie product and more like a fascinating time capsule of animation, music, friendship, and female-centered storytelling. Section 1.3 Audience Connection. If you grew up during the DVD era, there is a good chance you remember this movie before you remember why you loved it. Maybe the memory begins with a plastic case sitting on a shelf. Maybe it was a rental brought home for one weekend. Maybe it was the familiar menu screen you navigated so many times that you knew exactly which button would start the movie. And maybe, somewhere between the opening song and the final transformation, you simply accepted that Liana and Alexa were your friends too. That is the strange power of childhood media. We do not experience it analytically. We experience it physically. We sing along before we understand the lyrics. We remember the colors before we remember the plot. We recognize a melody years later before we can even explain where we heard it. For many children of the late 2000s, Diamond Castle belonged to that world. It was part of a larger ecosystem of DVDs, television specials, collectible dolls, soundtrack CDs, and after-school discoveries. Adults could easily dismiss the entire phenomenon as another extension of the Barbie brand. But children did not necessarily see the commercial machinery. They saw two girls with a guitar and harp, a magical world waiting beyond their garden, and a friendship that somehow survived everything thrown at it. That distinction becomes even more interesting now that the children who watched these movies have grown up. Online nostalgia culture has given forgotten childhood films a second life, with clips, songs, edits, covers, memes, and retrospective discussions turning private memories into shared cultural experiences. The movie can suddenly feel less like an artifact from 2008 and more like something rediscovered. And perhaps that is why revisiting it as an adult can be surprisingly emotional. The central conflict is not actually unfamiliar. It is the experience of watching a friendship change as life becomes more complicated. Childhood teaches us that friendship means being together constantly. Adulthood teaches us that friendship sometimes means surviving disagreement, insecurity, distance, jealousy, and different dreams without losing the connection underneath them. Liana and Alexa are not interesting because they never fail each other. They are interesting because they do. Their friendship matters precisely because it is tested. So if you loved this movie as a child, this analysis is not here to tell you that your nostalgia was naive. It is here to ask whether your younger self noticed something your older self can finally articulate. Part 2. Context Background. Section 2.1 Production Origins. To understand Diamond Castle, we have to return to the period when Barbie animation was becoming its own miniature cinematic universe. The early 2000s were a particularly unusual moment for computer animation. Pixar and DreamWorks were proving that CGI could carry sophisticated theatrical storytelling, while television and home video studios were discovering that the same technology could be adapted into much more economical production pipelines. Mattel found itself in the middle of that transformation. Barbie had already existed for decades as a fashion doll, but the animated films offered something different. They gave the character a recurring fantasy identity, and more importantly, gave children stories that could be revisited outside the toy aisle. Beginning with films such as Barbie and the Nutcracker, the brand developed a recognizable mixture of fairy tale imagery, musical storytelling, romance, elaborate costumes, and accessible moral lessons. Mainframe Entertainment became an important part of that evolution. The studio had already built a reputation in computer animation and had experience working under demanding production schedules. By the time the Barbie projects reached the later 2000s, the pipeline had evolved considerably. The characters could move through more elaborate environments, costumes could transform with greater visual spectacle, and magical effects could be integrated into musical sequences without requiring the film to abandon its relatively economical production model. But Diamond Castle arrived at an important point in Barbie's cinematic development. Earlier films had frequently relied on recognizable stories. Familiar fairy tales provided instant narrative architecture. Audiences already knew the basic rules, which meant the filmmakers could spend more energy on character design, music, and visual fantasy. Diamond Castle moved towards something more original. Instead of adapting a famous fairy tale, the film created its own mythology around the muses of music, a magical castle, a fallen artistic figure, and two ordinary girls whose friendship becomes central to restoring the world. That decision allowed the filmmakers to build a story around the Barbie brand without being completely dependent on public domain narrative structures. The music was equally important. The film was designed as a musical adventure, and the orchestral dimension gave it a scale that exceeded the apparent simplicity of its premise. The presence of a professional orchestra, including the Czech Film Orchestra, helped create a sonic environment where children's fantasy could borrow the emotional language of classical cinema. This is where the tension between commerce and creativity becomes especially revealing. Mattel obviously had commercial goals. The film could support dolls, instruments, costumes, pets, accessories, and other products. But the existence of those objectives did not prevent the filmmakers from creating genuine dramatic structure. In fact, the toy-related elements could sometimes be absorbed into the world rather than simply placed on top of it. The instruments are a perfect example. A guitar and harp are not merely objects that could become toys. They are extensions of Liana and Alexa's identities. Their music establishes intimacy, creates communication, and eventually becomes part of the story's supernatural logic. The same is true of the costumes and magical transformations. They provide visual appeal, but they also mark changes in the character's circumstances. The girls may move from humble surroundings into spectacular fantasy environments, yet the narrative repeatedly asks whether external beauty actually equals internal fulfillment. That question gives the production a surprising amount of coherence. The filmmakers were working inside a commercial system, but the story itself repeatedly argues that value cannot be measured through objects. And that contradiction may be one of the most interesting things about Diamond Castle. It was produced to sell a fantasy while telling children not to confuse fantasy possessions with genuine happiness. Section 2.2. Pre-release landscape. In 2008, the animation industry was already divided into different levels of prestige. At the theatrical end were films from Pixar and DreamWorks that dominated conversations about computer animation. WALL-E was turning a largely silent robot story into an emotional meditation on environmental collapse and human dependence on technology. Kung Fu Panda combined action spectacle, comedy, and surprisingly thoughtful character development. The theatrical marketplace increasingly taught audiences that animated films could be major cinematic events. Direct-to-video animation occupied a very different cultural space. It was cheaper, faster, and more closely connected to home entertainment. The films did not have to compete for theatrical screens, enormous advertising campaigns, or awards season attention. Their audience was often already waiting for them. Parents knew the brand. Children knew the characters. Retail shelves provided a second distribution system, and television could keep the property visible long after release day. For Barbie, this model was particularly powerful because the movie and merchandise ecosystems could reinforce each other. A child could watch the story, see the dolls advertised, recognize the characters in a commercial, hear the songs on television, and encounter related products in a store. The film became one component of a larger entertainment experience. But this created an obvious problem: perception. Adults often assumed that a direct-to-video Barbie movie existed primarily to sell toys. That assumption was not entirely unreasonable because the business relationship was obvious. Yet it also created a critical blind spot. If audiences entered expecting a commercial, they were less likely to look for the structural choices inside the story. The marketing leaned into the fantasy. Singing dolls, soundtrack products, colorful television promos, and character merchandise emphasized the musical and collectible elements. The visual language promised glittering castles, magical instruments, glamorous transformations, and familiar Barbie branding. Yet underneath that marketing was an unusually straightforward emotional pitch: two best friends against the world. That distinction mattered. The audience was not simply being offered another princess romance. Liana and Alexa were the emotional center from the beginning, and their relationship was presented as something valuable before any magical adventure began. The result was a fascinating contradiction in audience expectations. A viewer could reasonably expect a generic fantasy adventure, and instead discover a story where the central relationship was explicitly platonic, where the villain's greatest weapon was emotional manipulation, and where the final reward was not permanent access to wealth, but the restoration of an ordinary home. The direct-to-video format also meant that children could revisit the film repeatedly. That matters more than it might seem. A theatrical movie is experienced as an event. A DVD can become a ritual. The same songs can be replayed. The same jokes can become familiar. A child can memorize dialogue, anticipate transformations, and build an emotional attachment that grows through repetition. In that environment, a film does not need to win the critical conversation to succeed. It needs to become part of someone's routine. Diamond Castle understood that world perfectly. Its audience was not necessarily asking whether the CGI could compete with Pixar. They were asking whether Liana and Alexa would survive, whether the songs would be memorable, whether the castle would finally appear, and whether the friendship would remain intact. That was a different standard of success. Part 3 Story Recap. Section 3.1. Act 1 Setup. The story begins with Barbie and Stacy creating a framing device that immediately tells us this is not simply another fantasy adventure. The story is being remembered and passed down as a lesson about friendship. Stacy is dealing with conflict involving Courtney, and Barbie uses the tale of Liana and Alexa to explain something that becomes the emotional foundation of everything that follows. Real friendship is not defined by never fighting. It is defined by what happens after the fight. That framing matters because the film is ultimately less interested in fantasy than it first appears. The castles, magical mirrors, muses, enchanted instruments, and supernatural villains provide the external adventure. But the internal story is about two people learning what their bond can survive. When we meet Liana and Alexa, there is no palace waiting for them. There is no royal bloodline. There is no prophecy announcing their importance. They live together in a modest cottage surrounded by flowers, and their happiness comes from the small world they have created for themselves. Liana is practical and energetic, the kind of person who looks at a problem and immediately starts searching for a solution. Alexa is more cautious and imaginative, with a gentler temperament and a tendency to worry about what might go wrong. They are different, but their differences complement one another. Most importantly, they make music together. Their performance of two voices, one song, establishes the film's central idea before the plot even begins moving. Their voices overlap, their instruments respond to one another, and the song transforms friendship into a musical structure. One voice does not disappear into the other. The harmony works because both remain present. Their cottage represents the same principle. It is poor in material wealth but rich in emotional stability. They do not possess jewels or royal furniture, yet they have food, flowers, music, and companionship. The movie deliberately establishes this environment before introducing luxury because it wants us to understand what the girls already have. Then the storm arrives. The weather destroys their garden, damaging the fragile livelihood that keeps them alive. Suddenly, the cottage's warmth looks different. What seemed charming now becomes vulnerable. The storm is not simply a spectacle. It exposes the economic reality of their lives. This is the first major test of the film's philosophy. If happiness can survive only when circumstances are comfortable, then their friendship is not as strong as it appears. But Liana and Alexa do not immediately abandon each other. Instead, they face the crisis together. That decision begins the adventure. Their problem is not that they secretly want to become princesses. Their problem is that they need a way to survive. This is important because it keeps the early story grounded. The fantasy world is introduced through ordinary desperation, rather than royal ambition. And that is exactly why what happens next carries weight. When magic enters their lives, it does not offer them a random adventure. It offers them a possible escape from hardship. The question becomes whether they will remain themselves when the fantasy finally gives them everything they thought they lacked. Section 3.2. Act 1 Continued Call to Adventure. After the storm damages their livelihood, Liana and Alexa face a painfully simple problem. They need food. Their resources are almost gone and their options are limited. In a conventional fairy tale, this would be the moment when a magical benefactor appears with a grand solution. Diamond Castle does something more interesting. It first gives the girls an ethical choice. They have a jar of jam left. They could keep it. Under their circumstances, that would be entirely understandable. Instead, they trade it to an elderly woman for an old enchanted mirror. The decision is small, but it tells us something important about them. Even when they are hungry, they are capable of generosity. The mirror contains Melody, a young muse whose presence transforms the story from a survival problem into a mythic quest. Melody explains the history of the Diamond Castle and the muses of music. The world once existed in harmony, protected by three musical figures whose purpose was not merely to perform but to preserve balance. Dory, Phaedra, and Melody are connected to a larger artistic tradition, one where music represents communication, beauty, and collective creation. But Lydia has rejected that principle. Once a muse herself, Lydia becomes consumed by jealousy and the desire for control. Instead of seeing music as something that becomes stronger when shared, she sees it as a source of personal power. Her flute becomes an instrument of domination, and the Diamond Castle becomes the object of her obsession. This exposition could easily have become a lecture. Instead, the magical objects and characters keep the information active. Melody is not simply telling the audience what happened. She is explaining why the present world is broken. Then the threat arrives at the girl's home. Slider, Lydia's dragon-like servant, attacks with frightening efficiency. The cottage that represented safety is suddenly turned into a target. Flames consume the place where Liana and Alexa lived, and the destruction changes the emotional meaning of their journey. They are no longer leaving because adventure sounds exciting. They are leaving because there is nothing left to return to. This is the true threshold of the story. Their old life has been physically destroyed, and Melody's warning gives that destruction a larger purpose. If Lydia succeeds, the consequences will extend beyond two girls and their damaged garden. But the movie never lets the fantasy become completely detached from the personal. Liana is not fighting for an abstract kingdom. Alexa is not searching for treasure. They are moving forward because their home is gone, and because someone they have chosen to protect needs their help. The journey therefore becomes an extension of the friendship established in the opening. Their musical bond is now being tested outside the safety of their cottage, and Lydia has no idea yet how difficult that bond will be to break. Section 3.3. Act 2: A Rising Action. Once Liana and Alexa begin their journey toward the Diamond Castle, the movie expands into a classic fantasy road story. The girls move through forests, rivers, strange landscapes, and dangerous paths while trying to understand the world Melody has revealed to them. Along the way, they meet Ian and Jeremy, twin musicians who provide comic energy without taking control of the narrative. Their presence introduces a familiar fairy tale possibility. Perhaps the girls will eventually pair off with charming male heroes. But Diamond Castle consistently resists allowing that possibility to become the emotional center. Ian and Jeremy help. They joke. They participate in the adventure. They even provide moments of romantic possibility. But they never replace the central partnership. That choice is more important than it initially seems. The film could have used the male characters as traditional rescuers, particularly because Liana and Alexa are entering increasingly dangerous territory. Instead, the boys remain companions. The girls continue making the major emotional and strategic decisions themselves. The journey also introduces Sparkles and Lily, two stray puppies the girls adopt. Their presence adds comedy and warmth, but they also reinforce the film's repeated emphasis on care. Liana and Alexa are constantly giving something to others, even when their own resources are limited. Food becomes another recurring reminder of their circumstances. They have to share what little they possess, and every small act of generosity has consequences. The fantasy landscape may look enormous, but the girl's survival remains grounded in ordinary needs. Music continues to function as their most important tool. Songs are not interruptions between plot scenes. They reveal how the girls are processing the journey. When they sing together, fear becomes manageable. When they harmonize, uncertainty becomes something they can face collectively. But beneath the adventure, small cracks begin appearing. Liana tends to respond to danger by becoming more determined. When something goes wrong, she pushes forward. Alexa responds differently. She becomes frightened, uncertain, and increasingly aware of how much they have lost. Neither reaction is inherently wrong. The problem is that both girls begin interpreting the other's response as a personal failure. Liana can mistake Alexa's fear for weakness. Alexa can interpret Liana's determination as pressure. What once made them complementary begins creating friction. This is where the film's friendship writing becomes more sophisticated than its bright fantasy surface suggests. Conflict does not arrive because one character suddenly becomes evil. It emerges naturally from stress. They are tired. They have lost their home. They are surrounded by danger. They do not know whether they will succeed. Under those conditions, even people who love one another can become impatient. The audience can feel the midpoint approaching because the journey is no longer only about reaching the castle. It is about whether the two girls can reach it together. Section 3.4. Act 2B Midpoint Crisis. The greatest danger in Diamond Castle is not the dragon, the wilderness, or even Lydia's magic. It is temptation. When Liana and Alexa arrive at the luxurious mansion created by Lydia's enchantment, the environment offers Alexa something she has secretly wanted for much longer than the adventure itself. Comfort, security, beauty, a life where she never has to worry about scarcity again. The mansion is therefore not simply a magical location. It is a psychological trap. Lydia understands that fear can be manipulated more effectively than courage can be defeated. She does not need to convince Alexa that friendship is worthless. She only needs to make Alexa wonder whether friendship is enough. That distinction is crucial. Alexa has lived through poverty. She knows what it feels like to worry about food and safety. The mansion presents an alternative where every material problem disappears. The rooms are beautiful. The surroundings are luxurious. The possibility of security feels almost irresistible. And Lydia's magic takes advantage of the insecurity Alexa has been carrying. This is where the friendship begins to fracture. Liana sees what is happening and tries to pull Alexa away, but her urgency comes across as judgment. Alexa feels that Liana does not understand her fears. Liana feels betrayed that Alexa is allowing herself to be manipulated. Neither woman is completely wrong. That is what makes the argument painful. For much of the movie, music has represented their connection. Now that connection fails. Their voices no longer create harmony because their emotional priorities have diverged. The silence between them becomes more powerful than any villainous speech. Lydia captures Liana, and Alexa is left to confront the consequences of her decision. The story has reached its lowest point because the external mission and the internal relationship have collapsed at the same time. Melody's mirror is taken. The protagonists are separated. The possibility of restoring the muses appears to be disappearing. And Alexa has to face the realization that the luxury she wanted came with a price she never intended to pay. The film could have treated this as a simple lesson about not wanting material possessions. Instead, it gives Alexa a more human realization. Wanting security is not evil. Wanting a beautiful life is not evil. The mistake is allowing fear to convince you that security is worth sacrificing the people who make life meaningful. That distinction allows Alexa to grow without turning her into a villain. Meanwhile, Liana's own flaw becomes clearer. Her loyalty has always been admirable, but loyalty without patience can become control. She wanted to save Alexa, but she did not always know how to listen to her. Both girls therefore have something to learn. The lowest point is not simply where Lydia wins. It is where Liana and Alexa finally understand that loving someone does not automatically mean understanding everything they feel. To repair the friendship, they will need something stronger than certainty. They will need forgiveness. Section 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. The path back begins when Liana and Alexa realize that the friendship they nearly destroyed is also the only thing capable of defeating Lydia. Their reconciliation is not treated as a magical reset. They have to acknowledge what happened and recognize that both of them contributed to the fracture. The emotional turning point arrives through Connected, a song that transforms their relationship from simple companionship into conscious commitment. They are no longer together merely because they have always been together. They choose each other again after discovering that they could lose one another. That distinction completes the friendship arc. Now the girls can confront Lydia, but they do not defeat her through superior strength. They use intelligence, timing, and Lydia's own obsession against her. The villain believes control makes her powerful, yet that need for control becomes predictable. Liana and Alexa understand that Lydia expects resistance to come through force, so they approach the confrontation through strategy. The dark flute becomes central to the final battle. Lydia's instrument has always represented music corrupted by ego. It is designed to dominate rather than connect. By turning that power against her, the girls expose the weakness at the center of Lydia's philosophy. Lydia falls into the enchanted pool and is transformed into stone. The muses are restored. The diamond castle awakens. Light returns to a world that has been dominated by jealousy and fear. Yet the most important victory happens after the spectacle. Liana and Alexa are given the opportunity to live within the world of wealth and grandeur. They have spent the entire movie approaching. They could remain surrounded by diamonds. They could accept the fantasy life that seemed impossible at the beginning. Instead, they return home. Their cottage is restored, their garden returns, and their lives become simple again. This is one of the film's strongest choices because it completes the thematic circle. The girls began the story with almost nothing, and the story never tells them that poverty is inherently wonderful. Their hardship was real. Their hunger was real. Their destroyed home mattered. What changes is their understanding of what wealth is for. The diamond castle is beautiful, but it cannot replace belonging. Gold can provide comfort, but it cannot create trust. Magical objects can amplify music, but they cannot manufacture harmony between people who have stopped listening to one another. The girls return home not because they failed to become princesses, but because they have realized they never needed to become something else. Their simple cottage now carries an entirely different meaning. At the beginning, it represented everything they might lose. At the end, it represents everything they chose to keep. Part 4. Character Analysis. Section 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. Liana and Alexa work because neither one is designed to be the perfect protagonist. Instead, they function almost like two halves of a single psychological unit. Liana represents movement, resilience, and action. Alexa represents caution, reflection, and emotional sensitivity. Separately, each has a weakness. Together, those weaknesses can become strengths. Liana is the friend who keeps going. When the storm destroys their garden, she looks for solutions. When the journey becomes dangerous, she pushes forward. When Lydia appears, Liana instinctively wants to confront the problem rather than retreat from it. That determination makes her admirable, but it also creates her central flaw. Liana can become so focused on protecting the person she loves that she forgets protection is not the same thing as control. She wants Alexa to be brave because she believes they need courage to survive. But Alexa's fear is not simply an obstacle to the mission. It is part of her emotional reality. Liana sometimes pushes too hard. Alexa, meanwhile, is defined by vulnerability. She is imaginative and gentle, but she carries a deeper insecurity about whether she is capable of handling the world outside their small home. Her attraction to Lydia's mansion, therefore, does not come from shallow greed. It comes from fear. Alexa has experienced scarcity. She understands what it means to have too little. When Lydia offers her luxury, the temptation is powerful because it promises an end to uncertainty. That makes Alexa's eventual rejection of the mansion meaningful. She does not learn that material comfort is evil. She learns that comfort cannot become the price of abandoning herself. The friendship succeeds because the two women balance one another. Liana teaches Alexa to move forward despite fear. Alexa teaches Liana that moving forward without listening can hurt the people you are trying to protect. Their conflict is therefore structurally necessary. If the girls never disagreed, their friendship would remain decorative. The movie instead gives them a genuine rupture, forcing both characters to change. And that is why the dual protagonist structure matters. There is no single chosen hero who saves a passive companion. There are two protagonists whose arcs are inseparable. Liana cannot complete her journey without Alexa. Alexa cannot complete hers without Liana. Even their instruments reflect that relationship. A harp and a guitar produce different textures, different rhythms, and different emotional colors. Their power does not come from becoming identical. It comes from learning how to harmonize. That may be the simplest explanation for why their friendship remains so memorable. The film never asks which girl is more important. It asks what happens when both become stronger together. Section 4.2. Antagonist Psychology. Lydia is one of the most interesting villains in the Barbie animated universe because her evil is rooted in an idea, rather than simple destruction. She does not merely want the world to burn. She wants the world to recognize her. That distinction makes her dangerous. As a former muse, Lydia understands the value of music. She knows its emotional power. She understands harmony, performance, beauty, and the ability of sound to move people. Her tragedy is that she becomes convinced that those qualities should belong to her alone. Jealousy becomes artistic entitlement. Instead of asking how her music can contribute to a larger harmony, Lydia asks how she can control the harmony itself. The other muses stop being collaborators and become competitors. Their existence threatens her sense of uniqueness. That is why her desire for the Diamond Castle is more meaningful than a simple desire for treasure. The castle represents artistic authority. Whoever controls it can control the world of music surrounding it. Lydia's dark flute therefore becomes a perfect extension of her personality. Liana and Alexa use their instruments to communicate. Lydia uses hers to dominate. Their music moves outward toward another person. Lydia's music moves outward as a command. The contrast is both visual and auditory. The warm tones associated with the protagonist's instruments suggest openness and connection, while Lydia's darker musical identity creates an atmosphere of instability and control. This is where the film's villain becomes a thematic mirror. Lydia and the girls actually want something similar. They want music to matter. The difference is what they believe music is for. Liana and Alexa believe music becomes meaningful when shared. Lydia believes music becomes meaningful when it proves that she is powerful. That is essentially the difference between collaboration and narcissism. Her backstory also makes her more tragic, because the film suggests that she once belonged to the same creative community she eventually tries to destroy. She is not an outsider who never understood the muses. She is someone who understood them and became consumed by resentment. That is a particularly recognizable fear in creative environments. What happens when admiration becomes comparison? What happens when another person's success feels like an attack on your own identity? What happens when the desire to be special becomes a desire to silence everyone else? Lydia answers those questions in the worst possible way. She tries to become the only voice. And the movie ultimately defeats her with the opposite philosophy. One voice can be powerful. Two voices can create harmony. A community of voices can create something greater than any individual could create alone. Lydia's tragedy is that she understands music, but never understands collaboration. She can control sound. She cannot create connection. Section 4.3. Supporting cast dynamics. Melody, Ian, Jeremy, Slider, Sparkles, and Lily might appear secondary when compared with Liana, Alexa, and Lydia, but each contributes to the emotional architecture of the film. Melody is especially important because she functions as more than a damsel waiting to be rescued. She is the keeper of information. She understands the history of the Diamond Castle, the Muses, and Lydia's corruption. Without her, Liana and Alexa would not even understand the stakes of their journey. Yet Melody is also vulnerable. She is trapped inside the mirror, separated from the world she belongs to. That makes her knowledge incomplete without the courage of the protagonists. She knows what must be done, but she cannot accomplish it alone. The relationship therefore works both ways. Melody gives the girls knowledge. The girls give Melody agency. Ian and Jeremy provide a different kind of inversion. In a traditional fantasy adventure, two charming male characters could easily become the central rescuers. Here they remain supportive companions. They participate in the journey without replacing the female protagonists. Their humor also gives the film breathing room. The story deals with destroyed homes, magical manipulation, and friendship breakdowns, so lighter interactions prevent the narrative from becoming emotionally exhausting. Slider serves the opposite function. He is comedic in design but threatening in consequence. His dragon-like appearance adds fantasy spectacle, yet his attack on the cottage gives him genuine narrative importance. He is the force that makes the journey unavoidable. The puppies provide another layer of emotional warmth. Sparkles and Lily are adorable, but their role is more than decoration. Their adoption reinforces the protagonist's instinct to care for vulnerable beings, even when they themselves are struggling. That pattern appears throughout the film. Liana and Alexa give away food. They protect Melody. They care for animals. They help others even when they have little. Lydia does the opposite. She takes. She controls. She isolates. The supporting characters therefore strengthen the central contrast without needing to explain it directly. Melody represents knowledge shared. Ian and Jeremy represent assistance without domination. The puppies represent unconditional affection. Slider represents destructive force. Together, they create a world where the protagonist's philosophy of connection is constantly tested against different forms of power. And importantly, none of these characters needs to steal the climax. The final victory belongs to Liana and Alexa, because the entire story has been preparing us for their choice. The supporting cast exists to expand the world. The friendship remains its center. Part 5 Themes Symbolism. Section 5.1 Core Themes. The central theme of Diamond Castle can be reduced to a deceptively simple idea. True wealth is not what you possess. It is who remains beside you when everything else disappears. The movie establishes this principle through contrast. Liana and Alexa begin in poverty, yet their cottage feels emotionally full. Lydia creates a mansion overflowing with luxury, yet the environment is spiritually empty. The contrast is not telling children that poverty is preferable to comfort. It is asking them to distinguish comfort from fulfillment. That is why the mansion works as a temptation. If the girls were already surrounded by wealth, there would be nothing to learn. But because they have experienced scarcity, luxury carries emotional weight. Alexa's attraction to it is understandable. The lesson becomes stronger because the temptation is real. Then there is music. Music becomes the film's universal language, the thing capable of communicating what ordinary dialogue cannot. When Liana and Alexa sing together, they are not merely entertaining the audience. They are demonstrating a philosophy of coexistence. Two voices, one song is effectively the film's thesis statement. Two people can disagree without becoming enemies. Two identities can coexist without one dominating the other. Two voices can become more powerful through harmony. That idea reaches its emotional conclusion with Connected. The word itself explains the movie's worldview. Connection is not presented as weakness. It is the source of strength. The friendship functions almost like a covenant. Liana and Alexa repeatedly choose to protect one another. And when they fail, they must choose again. Their relationship therefore becomes more meaningful precisely because it survives conflict. This also explains why Lydia is such an effective thematic opposite. She wants music without community, power without cooperation, beauty without vulnerability, recognition without reciprocity. She represents what happens when creative expression becomes completely centered on the ego. The protagonists represent the opposite possibility. Art can connect people rather than separate them. That is why the film's musical conclusion feels like more than a happy ending. Harmony is restored because the characters learn to value one another again. The world is saved through the same principle that saves the friendship. Connection is the real magic. Section 5.2 Visual Symbolism. Diamond Castle's visual language is built around contrasts between the natural and the artificial, the humble and the spectacular, the warm and the cold. At the beginning, Liana and Alexa's world is dominated by flowers, soft earth tones, and natural textures. Their cottage feels small, but it is alive. The garden is imperfect, yet it grows. Their instruments sit comfortably inside this environment because music feels like another natural part of their lives. Then the diamond imagery begins taking over. Crystals sparkle. The castle shines. Luxury becomes geometric, polished, and almost unreal. The visual transformation is deliberately seductive. Diamonds reflect light beautifully, but they also create emotional distance. A flower grows from soil. A diamond is extracted, polished, and displayed. That difference mirrors the movie's thematic argument. The heart-shaped stones are particularly important because they combine material beauty with emotional symbolism. A heart is not valuable because it is expensive. It is valuable because it represents affection, trust, and connection. The stones therefore become physical reminders of what the girls are trying to preserve. Color also follows the emotional journey. The warmer pinks, purples, and earthy tones associated with the protagonists gradually give way to the brilliant blues, whites, and crystalline colors of the Diamond Castle. Yet the story eventually brings the girls back to their original environment. The visual lesson is subtle. Transformation does not mean permanently abandoning where you came from. The diamond castle itself functions almost like a visualized musical structure. Its reflective surfaces, symmetrical architecture, and crystalline geometry suggest resonance. It feels less like an ordinary palace and more like a monument built from sound and light. There are also echoes of classical temple architecture, reinforcing the film's connection to the mythology of the Muses. By contrast, Lydia's magic frequently introduces darker greens, murky lighting, and unstable visual effects. Her world feels less harmonious because her power is based on distortion. Even the river imagery contributes to the larger symbolism. Water represents movement, change, and trajectories that cannot be completely controlled. The girls begin in one place and are carried into another, but the journey does not erase their original identity. Their dresses follow a similar pattern. They become more elaborate as the story progresses, but the visual transformation works best when understood as an expression of confidence rather than proof of status. The girls do not become valuable because their clothing becomes beautiful. Their clothing becomes beautiful because the story has allowed them to become more fully themselves. That distinction prevents the visual spectacle from undermining the emotional message. The movie can celebrate diamonds without saying diamonds are what make people valuable. Section 5.3 Deeper Meanings. The mythology surrounding the Muses gives Diamond Castle a deeper cultural framework than its children's fantasy packaging might suggest. In classical Greek mythology, the Muses are associated with artistic inspiration. They represent different forms of creative expression, from poetry and music to history and other intellectual arts. Their importance comes partly from the idea that creativity is not merely entertainment. Art can shape how human beings understand themselves in the world. Diamond Castle borrows that basic concept and transforms it into a fantasy morality tale. The Diamond Castle becomes a kind of Olympus for artistic harmony, while the Muses represent the creative forces that sustain the world. The exact geography and mythology are adapted for the film, but the underlying idea remains recognizable. Art flourishes through inspiration and shared expression. Lydia's rebellion therefore becomes more than a villain plot. It becomes a critique of artistic monopoly. She wants to be the sole muse. She does not merely want to create great music. She wants everyone else to stop creating. That is a powerful metaphor for any creative environment, where success becomes competitive enough that another person's achievement feels threatening. The film's answer is essentially polyphonic. Harmony requires multiple voices. A chord is not powerful because every note is identical. It is powerful because different notes coexist in a meaningful relationship. That musical principle can also be read as a model for society. A healthy community does not require everyone to become the same. It requires people to listen. That is why Liana and Alexa's friendship matters beyond their individual personalities. They represent difference without domination. Liana can be practical while Alexa is cautious. One can lead in one moment while the other provides emotional insight in another. Their differences create harmony. Lydia cannot understand this because she interprets difference as competition. Her solution is elimination. The protagonist's solution is cooperation. The conflict therefore becomes philosophical. Creation expands when voices are shared. Destruction begins when one voice decides it deserves to silence all others. This is also why the movie's artistic message feels surprisingly relevant beyond children's entertainment. In a culture increasingly shaped by competition for attention, visibility, and recognition, Lydia's desire to become the only voice is almost painfully recognizable. The film does not solve that problem with a complicated argument. It solves it with a song. And perhaps that is the most elegant part of the metaphor. The answer to artistic narcissism is not silence. It is more voices. Part 6 Production Breakdown. Section 6.1 Animation Visual Effects. Watching Diamond Castle today means confronting a strange truth about late 2000s CGI. Technology can age dramatically while visual storytelling ages much more slowly. The film's computer animation is unmistakably from its era. Character models, environmental textures, lighting systems, and background assets lack the complexity audiences now expect from modern theatrical animation. Surfaces can look simplified. Secondary movement can feel stiff. Some environments appear to have been designed around economical reuse rather than exhaustive detail. But those limitations are not the entire story. Mainframe Entertainment had already spent years developing efficient computer animation pipelines, and by the time Diamond Castle was produced, the studio understood how to create fantasy spectacle without the resources of a Pixar-scale theatrical production. The solution was not to imitate Pixar shot for shot. It was to design around the strengths of the available technology. Magical sequences are especially revealing. Light beams, sparkling particles, glowing transformations, and supernatural effects give the film opportunities to emphasize visual spectacle without requiring every environment to contain hundreds of individually complex elements. Lighting becomes storytelling. When magic appears, brightness expands across the frame. When Lydia's influence takes over, the palette becomes darker and more unstable. The visual effects communicate emotional changes, even when the animation itself is relatively simple. Cloth and costume transformations are another example. Barbie films are fundamentally connected to fashion, so costume spectacle is essential. The filmmakers therefore had to make transformations feel dramatic, even when the underlying models and physics were limited compared with modern standards. The result is often more stylized than realistic. That is important because stylization can hide technological limitations. A realistic cloth simulation invites the audience to notice whether the physics are convincing. A fantasy transformation invites the audience to notice the color, shape, movement, and emotional timing. The same principle applies to water and environmental effects. Rather than attempting to reproduce every physical detail, the film focuses on readable movement and visual mood. This is where production constraints can sometimes generate creative discipline. A large budget allows filmmakers to place the camera almost anywhere. A smaller production forces them to ask which angles actually matter. Diamond Castle often relies on clear compositions, controlled environments, and carefully selected moments of spectacle. The camera does not need to explore every corner of the world if the audience understands the emotional purpose of the location. Background asset recycling is noticeable, especially to modern viewers. Yet it also reflects the economics of direct-to-video animation. The goal was not to create an infinite virtual world. It was to create enough visual variation to make the journey feel expansive, while keeping production manageable. That context changes how we evaluate the film. The question is not whether the animation can compete technically with a 2008 Pixar production. It obviously cannot. The more useful question is whether the technology was used effectively to support the story. And in its strongest sequences it was. The magic looks magical. The characters remain readable. The musical transformations have visual rhythm. The castle feels like a destination. For a production operating under very different economic conditions from theatrical animation, that achievement deserves more credit than its reputation usually allows. Section 6.2 Directorial Vision. Gino Nicoli's direction becomes most visible when the movie starts moving to music. Musical animation requires a different kind of visual discipline from ordinary dialogue scenes. The director has to coordinate character acting, camera movement, choreography, editing, vocal timing, and visual transformation so that the song feels like part of the story rather than an interruption. Diamond Castle repeatedly attempts this. During musical sequences, the camera can sweep across environments, shift perspective, follow character movement, or emphasize the relationship between performers. The goal is to create the sensation of a larger musical stage inside a relatively compact animated production. That theatrical instinct is important. A song cannot simply show two characters standing in one place while the soundtrack does all the emotional work. The visuals have to evolve with the music. The filmmakers therefore use camera movement and transformation to create progression. A quiet opening can establish intimacy. As the song expands, the framing becomes more dynamic. Magical elements appear. Costumes change. Environments brighten. The visual scale increases alongside the musical scale. This creates a miniature version of the classical Hollywood musical. The song begins as character expression and gradually becomes spectacle. Storyboarding would have been especially important here. Musical sequences have to be planned around beats, transitions, visual accents, and moments where animation and sound must land together. A transformation that happens half a second too early can weaken the impact of an entire musical phrase. That is why musical timing is one of the film's hidden technical achievements. The same principle applies to the voice performances. Kelly Sheridan's portrayal of Barbie's storytelling presence provides the framing warmth, while the performances associated with Liana and Alexa need to distinguish the two personalities without making their friendship feel fragmented. Liana requires confidence and momentum. Alexa requires sensitivity and uncertainty. If both voices sounded emotionally identical, the central metaphor of harmony would become weaker. The performers therefore have to create contrasts before the songs bring those contrasts together. The direction also has to preserve emotional credibility during exaggerated fantasy events. A character can be surrounded by glowing diamonds, magical creatures, and supernatural transformations, but the audience still needs to believe that the character's reaction is genuine. That balance is difficult. Too much realism makes the fantasy feel awkward. Too much exaggeration makes the characters feel weightless. The best moments find the middle ground. Nicholi's direction also benefits from the decision not to let the romantic subplot dominate the story. Ian and Jeremy can contribute charm without pulling the camera away from Liana and Alexa's emotional journey. The result is a film that understands where its dramatic center belongs. The spectacle can grow. The castle can shine. The villains can become larger. But the camera keeps returning to the friendship. That consistency is a major reason the movie holds together despite its limited animation budget. Part 7 Music Sound. Section 7.1 Musical Score Analysis. If the story is about connection, the score has the difficult job of making that connection audible. Arnie Roth's orchestral approach gives Diamond Castle a musical foundation that is larger than the film's modest direct-to-video identity might suggest. Instead of treating orchestral music as background decoration, the score uses changing textures to distinguish characters, environments, and emotional states. Strings can create warmth and movement. Woodwinds can add lightness or mystery. Percussive elements can increase urgency. And Lydia's flute becomes especially important because it carries an entirely different emotional identity from the protagonist's instruments. This creates something close to a leitmotif system. A leitmotif is a recurring musical idea associated with a character, place, object, or concept. Film audiences often recognize this technique from major fantasy franchises, but the principle works just as effectively in children's animation. When a musical idea returns in a new context, the audience remembers the emotional meaning attached to it. That makes Two Voices, One Song especially important. Its musical identity is associated with Liana and Alexa's bond, so when the film develops its action sequences and emotional transitions, the underlying ideas of harmony and partnership can be echoed in different forms. The music therefore becomes a kind of emotional memory. The Diamond Castle has its own sonic identity as well. The orchestral texture surrounding the castle suggests scale and wonder, making the location feel larger than the girls' ordinary world. Lydia's music moves in the opposite direction. Her flute is not merely another instrument in the ensemble. It becomes a symbol of isolated artistic power. The sound is associated with enchantment, control, and emotional distortion. That contrast gives the final confrontation additional meaning. The protagonists do not defeat Lydia by proving that her music is stronger. They defeat the philosophy behind it. Her sound represents domination. Their sound represents collaboration. The orchestra becomes the space where those ideas can coexist, clash, and ultimately resolve. This is one reason classical musical language works so well for the film. Orchestral music can make an emotional event feel larger than the dialogue describing it. A character may say that something is frightening, but the score can make the audience feel the fear before the words arrive. For a young viewer, this may register simply as excitement. For an adult viewer, the structure becomes easier to recognize. The film is constantly assigning musical identities to emotional states. Harmony means connection. Discord means fracture. Expansion means discovery. Darkness means control. Restoration means the return of balance. The music is therefore doing narrative work. It is helping tell the story even when the characters stop speaking. Section 7.2. Songs Sound Design. The songs of Diamond Castle are memorable partly because they arrive at moments when the characters need to express something that ordinary dialogue cannot contain. Two voices, one song, establishes the emotional grammar of the friendship. Its duet structure is essential. The two voices do not simply sing the same melody in unison. Their interaction creates the sense that the relationship itself is producing something neither character could create alone. That is the musical equivalent of the movie's central thesis. "We're gonna find it" shifts the emphasis from identity to determination. The characters are no longer simply celebrating what they have. They are moving towards something unknown, and the song gives that movement momentum. Believe adds another emotional layer, connecting hope with uncertainty. Then Connected completes the larger musical journey. The significance of these songs comes partly from placement. If every musical number simply stopped the plot so the characters could perform, the film would feel episodic. Instead, the songs generally emerge from the emotional circumstances of the story. The characters sing because something is happening inside them. The lyrics clarify what they cannot easily explain. The melody turns private emotion into shared experience. This is especially important in a film where friendship itself is the subject. A duet is inherently relational. It requires listening. It requires timing. It requires another voice to exist. That makes vocal harmony a literal storytelling mechanism. When Liana and Alexa are connected, their voices can blend. When their friendship breaks, that musical unity becomes emotionally impossible. The soundtrack therefore reflects the plot's emotional progression. Even the sound design around magic supports this structure. Instruments become associated with identity, while magical effects create sonic transitions between ordinary reality and fantasy. Lydia's flute is particularly effective because it sounds like an instrument of control rather than communal performance. The difference between woodwinds, strings, and other orchestral textures creates an acoustic world that feels larger than the dialogue itself. And that is why the songs have survived beyond the movie. A visual sequence can become dated when rendering technology improves. A melody does not care what year it was recorded. If a song captures a feeling accurately, it can cross generations. That helps explain why adults who have forgotten individual plot details can still remember pieces of the soundtrack. They may not remember every cave, forest, or magical object, but they remember the feeling of two voices becoming one. The songs are not simply what the characters sing. They are what the movie believes. Part 8. Cultural Impact. Section 8.1. Immediate Reception. When Diamond Castle arrived in 2008, its success had to be measured differently from the theatrical animation dominating mainstream headlines. It was not competing for the same screens or advertising space as Pixar or DreamWorks. Its real battlefield was the home. The DVD shelf mattered. Television mattered. Toy aisles mattered. Repeat viewing mattered. And Barbie already had an enormous advantage. Children recognized the character before the movie began. The film did not need to spend its entire runtime convincing audiences to care about its central brand. Instead, the marketing could emphasize fantasy, music, fashion, and collectibles. That ecosystem made the movie more commercially resilient than a conventional standalone animated title might have been. A child could discover the movie through television, encounter the characters through dolls, hear the songs elsewhere, and then return to the film. The soundtrack also strengthened that connection. Music creates an unusual bridge between media. A toy can reproduce a character's appearance, but a song can reproduce an emotional memory. A child who repeatedly hears two voices, one song, can carry the melody outside the film itself. That matters because direct-to-video success often depends on repeat engagement rather than one-time theatrical attendance. The movie's target audience was also unusually receptive to repetition. Children frequently rewatch favorite films until dialogue and songs become familiar. A title does not have to surprise them every time. It has to make them want to return. Diamond Castle had that quality. The story contained recognizable fantasy ingredients, but the friendship between Liana and Alexa gave it an emotional anchor. Young viewers could identify with the girls' closeness, disagreements, fears, and eventual reconciliation. Adults evaluating the film from the outside might see the obvious commercial machinery. Children saw a story. That difference is central to understanding the movie's reception. The Barbie brand could sell a doll, but it could not force a child to care about the relationship between two characters. That emotional response had to come from the story itself. The film therefore succeeded where many licensed properties struggle. It created memories that were not reducible to merchandise. For its original audience, Diamond Castle became part of a larger childhood media landscape. It was watched at home, replayed during school holidays, shared with siblings and friends, and remembered through songs. That kind of cultural presence rarely appears in a traditional box office report. It lives in repetition. It lives in memory. And eventually it lives online. Section 8.2. Long-term influence. The Internet gave Diamond Castle something its original release could never have provided. A second cultural life. A generation that had watched the movie as children eventually gained access to platforms where nostalgia could become collective. YouTube essays, TikTok edits, music covers, reaction videos, memes, and social media discussions allowed people to compare memories that had once seemed completely private. Suddenly, the question was not, "Did you watch this?" It became, "You remember this too?" That shared recognition is powerful. Two voices, one song became especially suited to nostalgia culture because the concept itself invites participation. Two people can sing it together. Friends can recreate it. Fans can perform covers. The song can exist independently of the original animation, while still carrying the emotional identity of the film. TikTok culture also changes how older media is experienced. A scene that once required an entire DVD can now circulate as a 15-second clip. A line that seemed ordinary in childhood can become funny years later. A transformation can become an aesthetic edit. A song can be detached from its original context and discovered by someone who was not even born when the movie premiered. This is how forgotten media becomes culturally active again. But the film's strongest long-term appeal is not simply nostalgia. It is the friendship. Gen Z audiences have become particularly interested in older media that depicts female relationships without reducing them to competition. Liana and Alexa are not rivals fighting over the same prince. They are not defined primarily through romantic jealousy. Their relationship is the story. That distinction gives the movie a surprisingly modern emotional identity. It also explains the renewed interest in merchandise. Original dolls and other products from the period can carry sentimental value because they represent a specific childhood experience rather than merely a collectible object. The object becomes a memory container. A doll from 2008 is not just plastic. For someone who grew up with the movie, it can represent a bedroom, a school holiday, a sibling, a song, or a time when the world felt smaller. That is why Diamond Castle's legacy cannot be measured only by contemporary reviews. Its most important audience may have needed 15 years to become old enough to explain why it mattered. And now they can. The film has become part of a broader nostalgia conversation about what 2000s children's entertainment gave its audience. Bright fantasy, dramatic music, emotional friendships, and stories that sometimes contained more sincerity than adults expected. Part 9. Critical Analysis. Section 9.1. Critics versus Audience. The gap between critical perception and audience affection is one of the most revealing parts of Diamond Castle's legacy. Direct-to-video animation entered the cultural conversation with a built-in disadvantage. The phrase itself sounded secondary. Theatrical animation was treated as cinema. Direct-to-video animation was often treated as product. That distinction encouraged critics to evaluate the format before evaluating the individual film. And Barbie carried an additional burden. The brand was associated with toys, fashion, and commercial culture. For some observers, that was enough to assume that a Barbie animated movie could not possess serious artistic ambition. But audiences operate differently. A child does not ask whether the production model is respectable. They ask whether the story makes them feel something. They ask whether the characters are likable. They ask whether the song is memorable. They ask whether the ending feels satisfying. Diamond Castle succeeds on those terms. Its structure is remarkably clean. The opening establishes the friendship. The storm creates the immediate problem. Melody introduces the larger mythology. The destruction of the cottage forces the journey. The adventure tests the friendship. Lydia exploits the resulting weakness. The girls reconcile. The final confrontation resolves both the external and internal conflict. That is not accidental storytelling. It is classical structure adapted to children's fantasy. The music reinforces the structure rather than disrupting it. The character arcs reinforce the theme rather than contradicting it. Even the final decision to return home completes the argument established in the opening. This coherence can be easy to miss when the animation is visually dated. But storytelling does not become less structured because the render quality is old. That is why retrospective viewing can produce a different response. Once the cultural hierarchy surrounding direct-to-video animation becomes less important, the film can be judged on its actual construction. It is not perfect, but it is carefully built. The audience who loved it may not have been able to explain that when they were 8 years old. They did not need to. They simply recognized that the movie understood something about friendship that mattered to them. Critics looked at the category. Children looked at the story. Years later, adults can finally compare both perspectives. And that is where the film becomes most interesting. Section 9.2. Controversies, criticisms. Defending Diamond Castle does not require pretending its weaknesses do not exist. The animation has obvious limitations. Background assets are sometimes reused in ways that become noticeable. Environments can feel visually sparse. Secondary characters occasionally move with less fluidity than modern audiences expect. Lighting can appear simplistic, especially when compared with contemporary theatrical CGI. Those limitations matter. Animation is not merely a delivery system for story. Visual quality affects immersion, and viewers accustomed to modern rendering may find the movie difficult to approach without noticing its age. The pacing also has weaknesses. The third act moves quickly, especially once the characters escape their lowest point and begin approaching the final confrontation. The emotional material is strong, but some resolutions happen with the speed of a production that has limited runtime.